Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Before we introduce today's guest, as a reminder, please send me a DM on our Twitter handle at the HPH_podcast for any kind of questions that we can answer at the onset of each episode. Today's question comes from Sammy. He states, Coach, are there any current books that you've read that you strongly recommend? Great question, Sammy. A lot of the books that I've read recently have nothing but everything to do with training and strength and conditioning. But one that I've found very valuable, read about a year ago, was by Dan Cleather, Force. It's a fantastic book. It talks about physics. It talks about performance and how we can read force time curves. It talks about the force velocity relationships, some of the mishaps that we see in common strength and conditioning, force vector, and more misconceptions on the direction of force. It's just a really interesting book that I strongly recommend. One of the things that I had a major takeaway from on the book was the actual force time curve. Before that time, I really looked at the variables that were spit out from our force plates, and now I actually look at the shape of the curve in much more detail, rather. Dan talks in this book about impulse being, the area underneath that curve. And he says to think of it as total force. There's three ways to improve impulse. Dan would also state that impulse, a change in impulse, an increase in impulse, has a direct relationship to a change in velocity. So that's great for increased performance. Three ways to do that. I look at it as a big mountain. Number one is increase peak force. So increase the height of the mountain, increase rate of force development, which is the steepness of the mountain, or increase the time, so the average force that is being applied, so the width or the base of the mountain. So I look at all those three when I look at, sessions, whether it's weeks, months, etc. But looking at an athlete compared to an athlete after an intervention or after an injury, one of the many takeaways I took away from Dan. It's funny that we actually speak about this idea with today's guest, who happens to be a good friend of mine. Today's guest is a friend, a great strength and conditioning coach in his own right, performance expert in his own right. It happens to be Curt Truhe. Curt has over 13 years of experience in training elite athletes. He's worked across multiple professional sports leagues, including the National Hockey League, the NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA, PGA, and Special Ops. He spent 5 years with the Arizona Coyotes in the National Hockey League, collaborated with top athletes, the private sector, such as Exos, Sanford Health. Currently, he serves as a director of performance for Excel Sports Management, where he leads performance initiatives for athletes at the highest levels. Outstanding conversation. We speak about Curt's path, all from Exos to the Arizona Coyotes, now obviously in his current capacity. We speak about advice for young coaches. We speak about measurement. We speak about metrics. We speak about the quest for knowledge. It's a fantastic episode. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Curt. Thanks so much for joining us, my man.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Obviously, a long-time listener, and I assumed you had the wrong number when you sent me the text asking to be on based off some of the other guests you had. So, obviously, very humbled by the opportunity to be here and chat with you.
Hey, buddy, I'm excited, and I know the audience is as well. I got to think about the only time I actually physically shook hands with you and met you was in Columbus. You were a part of the Arizona Coyotes. So let's rewind back at that time. And I know you've got a very storied career in strength and conditioning. So walk us back. You were in Exos at the time, and then you walk us through that path, that progression path, Exos, Arizona, where you're at right now.
Yeah, so started off as soon as I graduated college. Obviously, my athletic career ended there, but always wanted to kind of stay involved with it. So started just right out of college, more just personal training, a couple high school athletes here or there. The place I was at the time, it was very much I wanted to grow as a coach, and it was very much like, you're making money, you're making us money. Let's just kind of keep rolling here. So saw the writing on the wall there pretty quick. So at the age of 24, left that to go do an internship at Exos. Met great people there. Obviously, the growth, the knowledge. I felt like it was kind of one of the heydays of Exos as far as the people that were there, from Winkleman to Dennis Logan, Brett Bartholomew, kind of a mutual friend of ours. So a lot of great mentors and through that side. And I met JP Major, who was the head strength coach at the Coyotes. I knew him from before, but just really got to grow that relationship with him out there. Once that finished, stuck around, did some kind of consulting work, or not consulting, but kind of just like contracted work through like the NFL Combine and some of the groups they had at the time. Took another opportunity out in Richmond, Virginia to be a performance coordinator at a gym out there. And about 6 months in, I got the call from JP saying, "Hey, do you want to come?" I got the thumbs up to bring someone else on staff. I was thinking, like, I just moved out to Virginia, across the country. Like, I haven't been here long. I like the work. And he kind of spun it to me, and just as, probably about, this has been in 2014, so, almost 9 years ago. Just to give you some perspective on where the league was from the performance side at that time, he goes, there's only a handful of teams that have more than one guy. He goes, so think about this, take your time. He's like, but you're going to be about one of 40 people in the world that get to work in this league. I'm like, okay, when do I start? So that took me from kind of Virginia. I went back to the Coyotes and spent 5 years there. For those that are familiar with Arizona, within one team, I feel like we got the view of what several organizations would be like.
Sure.
Saw multiple management groups, saw multiple ownership groups, multiple GMs, multiple coaching staffs, multiple performance and medical staff. So I feel like I got a pretty good grasp of what some of the pros and cons of that setting are.
It's something that tying back with what you initially talked about, which was your start. You said, I quickly realized I just wanted to learn and I wanted to continue to grow and evolve. I speak from a small private facility in Columbus, Ohio. And I can tell you, I think that probably is one of the most important qualities for any young coach to have:
Yeah.
curiosity and the willingness to learn. I realize that sometimes, specifically within the private sector, being a young coach, it's not always about the end of the day, the pay. But if you can be in a situation where you feel like you're growing, you're learning, you're getting out of your comfort zone, that pays dividends on down the line.
100%. I think, the best thing you can develop as a coach is context and the ability to look at problems from different surroundings, different situations, trying to be creative and finding solutions to what you're dealing with. And that only comes through different experiences, unique experiences, and growth. Super grateful for all the experiences I had. Like, I've worked within hospital settings before. I worked at small private gyms. I worked in the team setting. I worked at, Exos at the time, and, still today is viewed as one of the elite in the private space. So all of those different experiences have kind of molded my thought process now. And even in my current role, where it's a lot more just talking with people in teams and private settings and doing more of the consulting stuff, you get a grasp of context of like where maybe their troubles are with the problem that you're bringing to them or the athlete that they're working with, and just being able to understand those things. I know our good friend Brett that we talked about earlier, he always talks about the difference between exposure and experience. And so putting yourself in those situations to experience what those people could be going through, whether that's your athlete or the other coach or practitioner you're working with, just goes a long ways as far as kind of helping to build that relationship.
100%. Parlaying right into what we talked about, your current position, Excel Sports Management. Talk to the audience about, what you're doing right now at the current moment with this relatively new appointment.
Yeah, so Excel Sports Management is a sport agency. So I always joke that this role, and this is just for me, but personally, this is kind of like the holy grail of roles. I've seen the private side, I've seen the team side, and they both have their pros and they both have their cons. It feels like the private side, from the seasonality of the clients, kind of coming in off seasons, you get to train, you get to do the fun stuff. But I don't have to sell at all. I don't have to talk about how my product's so much better than everyone else's, and that's why you should come to me or continue to come to me. It's, hey, if you're part of this agency, like, this is a service that belongs to you. And then on the team side, it's the logo. It's there's people that are hesitant to give you information and hesitant to do things. They don't want to do it given the time of year. We talk about it all the time, and I know you reference this a lot, is the expert's never the one in the room. There's certain times I get to be the guy in the other area. I get to be the guy that's kind of the pseudo expert because of the role that I'm given. So obviously not trying to take advantage of that or abuse that in any capacity, but just understanding that within that role, like, there comes a level of trust and buy-in. There's no one more directly aligned with an athlete than their agency. And so sometimes I can get athletes to do things or kind of comply with things. And ultimately my goal is to work with the teams to make sure that everything's at the best of the athlete. For the most part, there's certain people in management, maybe with certain organizations, that that aren't as invested in every individual athlete, but I feel like everyone else, like the team services side, the support staff, like they're there for the athlete and they want the same thing. So it's always good to kind of collaborate with those different groups and just make sure the athlete's in the best position. And that's kind of our role kind of globally with the agency is what is each individual athlete's support system, whether that's in season, off season? Are there certain gaps from nutrition, sports psychology, recovery, whatever? Are there any gaps that are not being provided? And can we step in and help fill those or provide them a resource to kind of fill those gaps so they feel like there's nothing missing from the opportunity they have to develop as an athlete?
So essentially, holistic care, right? If I'm reading this right, you've got a
Yep,
management staff, and then from there, your role is essentially coordinating everything from strength and conditioning, which might be you, it might not, physical
correct.
therapy, medical, etc. So it's a holistic package for the athlete, whoever's under contract with that agency. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Yep, that's accurate. And I think something you hit on there is the most important thing is it doesn't have to be us, right? We're not a private facility that generates revenues by providing services. It's a sport agency. We get revenues by increasing marketability from marketing standpoints and signing bigger contracts. So we don't have to be the ones that train you. If you're in a good spot and you have a good system, by all means, who are we to try to adjust that or change that? Now, for some people that have limited resources or are looking for a home in the off season, by all means, I think we do that at a very, very high level. Come out here in Southern California. It's not a bad place to be pretty much any time of the year, and we'll take care of you. But the beauty is it doesn't have to be us. And so the ability to collaborate with people and being able to take this approach is usually very unthreatening for them. So it puts down people's filters and allows for just some really good conversations and growth on both ends.
Well put, and non-threatening. I have to rewind myself probably 15, 20 years when I knew it all, right? I was in the middle of the
Yeah.
Dunning-Kruger effect. And, I had the answer before the question was asked. And now it's so opposite, right? Everything is, it depends. I don't know, perhaps. And I'm much more, I say, humble from a knowledge standpoint. I just realize how much I don't know. But I remember those days almost thinking that, how dare I talk with another strength coach? I had the answer. And oh my gosh, what a naive and ignorant, I think about it now, how many smart coaches, both in the private sector, both in the professional sector, that I've had the opportunity and the honor of interviewing and I consider good friends. And the reality is that if you can continue to grow a great network of people, obviously there are some people that you're like, okay, I got to stay away from that guy or girl. Maybe it's just a social media guru or whatever. But when you think about it from a humility standpoint and a communication standpoint and an athlete first standpoint, it's a game changer both for personal growth, but most importantly for athletic care and athlete care.
Absolutely. If that's at the center of the conversation, like you
100%.
can't go wrong, right? Like you
Yep.
don't have to believe with everything everyone's saying. And
Yep.
that's the beauty of kind of what we do, especially in the facility. We sit as more of, like I said, it can be a training facility, but can be a diagnostic facility as well too, right? We call it your doctor's checkup, your annual checkup. Pop in for a week, a weekend, whatever, show you the space, go out to dinner with your agent, whatever it is. Let's put you through some testing and understand there's context that's going to surround every one of those data points. But like, hey, let's just see where you're moving, right? And how does that affect? And the beauty of being tied to an agency is the resources that gives you that kind of holistic approach. Like we have people in the scouting department that are valuing what metrics matter for this sport and how are they performing in those. We have skill coaches that work with all of our guys like, hey, when you look at more of that kind of technical demographic, like where does this person sit compared to their peers? And then obviously we have this physical side and we have sports psychologists that help on the psychological side and just PTs and the health and wellness. We do a full assessment when you're here. It's like, hey, let's just see how all these things, we call it our ecosystem. Like, how are these things all blending and ebbing and flowing and understanding that, especially guys that make it professionally, obviously some of our development guys, right? Like, how do we grab all those areas and try to stretch them out? But at a certain point professionally, you understand that it's trade-offs and ebbs and flows. And as you go to different seasons, how do you know what to prioritize? And our goal is to never, right? We can't take the stance as a sport agency. We can't take the stance of like, here's what you need to do. It's how do we present you with the information so you can come up with these decisions on your own. Now, if you need help finding a resource, by all means, like we'll guide you in the right direction, but it has to be somewhat athlete led, but them making the best decision comes from them being informed. And right. And so just creating that level of understanding that all these different areas, one exists. And here's a pretty good idea of where you sit on all these. Now, how do we put a plan into action, whether that's early off season, late off season, going into preseason, you're at the end of the year, and here's some fall off we saw from the year before, whatever it is. you understand and better understand that athlete. And I think the goal of what we're trying to do, through the agency is that, whether it's in the private setting or in the team setting, the reality is your support system sometime throughout your career is probably going to switch, if not multiple times.
Oh,
How do we just make sure that you're not starting from scratch whenever you jump into that next group, next team, whatever that is?
100%. And I'll get off on a tangent here. I just think of that. I think it's so rare. And you might say, okay, college hockey or college sports, you get a kid for 4 years in a row. But as we know now with the NIL, good luck with that. Rosters
Yep.
change so fast, right? Continuity of training. I heard this several years ago. Lauren Landau was, I think, speaking with Eric Kress. He said, what's the biggest issue that you see? And he talked about this idea of continuity in training. How rare it is to be able to train an athlete for a considerable amount of time. Like, give you an example of an athlete that might train with us that's a lifelonger that's trained with us from essentially pee-wee age demographic U14 to pro. I mean, the continuity in training is still not there. It's not like they've trained with us that whole time. We see them maybe 12 to 16 weeks in the summer, right? The
Yeah.
rest of the year,
Yep.
they're gone, which is a massive challenge. At any rate, I'm off on a totally separate tangent here, but you mentioned athletes coming in and measuring and managing and metrics and what you hold value in. I want you to walk back in time. Believe it was 2010 when you first were in the National Hockey League. I'd imagine the landscape was very different, right? 14 years ago.
Yes, 2014 I started, so 10 years ago.
Sorry, 10 years ago. Walk me through at the time, and there may be a lot, there may be a little, what it was that you valued and what it was that you thought was important to measure, if anything.
As I think about this too, I think a lot of this is coming maybe from an approach of kind of a little like post-spection of kind of the
Yeah,
evaluation based off where I am now, right? At the
sure.
time, I think turns out we were maybe a little better than I thought we were at the time too. But when we were going right away, it was your basic, right? Like both JP and myself were coming from the private setting. It was like, let's understand who these people are physically,
Yep,
right? And so it was the push-up test, pull-up test,
yep.
VO2 max, just from like a testing, preseason testing standpoint, VO2 max, all these things. And it's like every year, all we did was just we cut stuff out. Right, we remove stuff. It's like it's preseason camp. Why are they here right now? So they're here to try to make an NHL hockey team. Why does it matter how many damn push-ups they can do to the Metrodome to stay on pace? Right. And so it's like, are we getting anything from that information? So we completely revamped our thought process into it kind of boils down to kind of a couple different things. One, if you think from like an athlete perspective, especially us as we're looking at hockey athletes, they kind of fall into four buckets. Think of it as like a quadrant report, if you will, right? There's your super twitchy guys, your explosive guys, right? High power outputs on our watt bike stuff, like fast skate, whatever it is. Big jumpers on the vert, broad, whatever that is. There's those guys. Then there is the spectrum of the guys that don't do that, right? And then there's the guys that just like they don't hit these huge powers, but they can go and they can go and they can go and they can go. And then there's the guys that, usually it's the high power guys that fall off. Then you have your freaks that have both. And then you have your high skill guys that probably have neither. Right. And so our goal is if we're going to put you through some sort of testing, does it give us some sort, whether that's on ice or off ice, does it give us some sort of view into where you fall on these spectrums of this scale? Right. Because then as we look at like the training side in season, like Fitzy talks about it all the time. It's like it's just a big warm up in season, right? That's all we ever really do. There's very few windows for lifting training. You take advantage of them when you can. But it's like, hey, if you do have a few of these opportunities, how do we just make sure that we better understand who you are? And so maybe we can nudge you in some of these directions based off what your role is with the team, what your expectations are, what you need to do from a minute standpoint, and how we need you to execute on the ice. Maybe if you're the high burst guy, but you're also one of our top D men, like maybe it's we do a little aerobic capacity day when the window or opportunity presents itself, and vice versa for those guys that need a little bit more pop. So how do we better understand where you're at? And so we did that with, a watt bike test, some of our jump metrics that we use. And then anything else we did is like, how do we establish baselines for you? Whether that's from the performance standpoint, as far as whether that's jumping on the force plates, whether that's PT screens, right, wrong, or indifferent. We did the FMS, like that's a whole another tangent of where your thoughts are on that and everyone's thoughts on that. But we did it year in and year out. And so when we're the ones with the eyes viewing guys every year, we have to understand what we're looking for. And the system just allowed us to get a better insight into that. So if for some reason it's the NHL, when's something going to happen to you from an injury standpoint? Do we have at least somewhere to start or better understand where you came from? So I think As you asked the question, the first thing we valued is how do we better understand our athletes and how we can serve them. Also, I think something we valued is what is the coach's approach. We had Dave Tippett and we had Rick Tocchet. You want to talk about some polar opposites, both great guys, great coaches for very different reasons. I think one of the hardest things for a coach to do is forget what made them successful, right? Dave Tippett, a super skilled guy, not oversized, just knew the game really well. X's and O's were very important to him. On the physical side, he was kind of hands off. Like, do what you need to do, take care of our guys however you see fit, but that's your area. Whereas Talk was in the gym working out every day. He was always there giving it to guys that weren't there working out. And he was a tough, hard-nosed guy, and that's how we expected our team to play. And so maybe some of the things that you do from a training standpoint or just an intent standpoint adjust more to reflect that. So understanding what was important to them, the coaching staff, the system that way. And I think the third thing we valued is trying to better understand the game. We created I said we were very limited in our resources at the time in Arizona. I don't think it's a huge secret. We were an under budgeted team for a good chunk of the time, and so the resources weren't quite there. So, JP and myself, we created kind of a stress system. It's kind of 7 day rolling average based on, did we play games? Did we practice? How often? How long was the practice? Did we have a workout? Did we travel? Just any other things that could kind of add to stress. And then what we did was every game we rolled, where's that 7 day rolling average compared to the results of the game? And I think quickly we realized that, there's sometimes that the results of the game isn't what the game was, right? And so how do we add additional context? So that's where we started working with our analytics team, and they have metrics where they have predicted scores on the back end. So it's like, sometimes our guys played their bags off. They were in a setting that like they should have been really good to go physically, but we lost 2-1. You just ran into a hot goaltender. So if we're looking at that data a year later, it's like, oh man, maybe we weren't in a good spot then. It's like, no, we were. Technically, according to Brad, who did a lot of our analytics, like we should have won that game 4-1. But here's the reality of it. And so just better understanding kind of how things are leading into the results of games.
I think a couple things stood out for me. Number one, for me, and this is just my own unique journey. I think I just was talking with Mike Robertson a couple podcasts ago, and we talked about this idea of testing and monitoring. And for me, a very similar. Over the years, it's not so much what I've added; it's what I've taken away. There's a lot of things that are interesting, and not many things that are important. And I'm the kind of person that I could get into interesting for a whole day and dig so deep in a rabbit hole. But at the end of the day, when you come up, it's like, really, was that just the other two things that I think are really important? One, understanding the game. To me, that's just foundational. And when I say understanding the game, everything from the physiology, the biomechanics, the workloads, and maybe even more importantly, and I don't want to pat myself on the back. That's not what I mean. But I played hockey, right? I played college
Yep.
hockey. I played minor pro hockey. The language, right? Being able to
Yep.
communicate with the guys, and then understanding the coaches. And you're exactly right. There are certain coaches that value certain things. There's certain that don't. Certain that say, "Hey, you're the guy. Do whatever you need," or conversely, show me this, show me that. I think those are all
Yep.
really important things. Now, in the setting that you're in, is it mostly all NFL players, or all football, or is it all?
No, it's all. I said the unfortunate thing is we don't have a hockey division, so
Okay.
I don't get my touches in that as much as I would like to or used to. But no,
Yep.
we have NFL, NBA, MLB, WNBA, PGA, LPGA. So pretty much all major sports other than hockey. So it's been great from that standpoint.
What are you looking at if you come in or have someone come in for testing? I know it might depend. You can walk me through a fictitious athlete. Perhaps it's a football player. What are you looking for? I know it's a brief window, but something that you might be able to collect baseline from or give an idea on in terms of either performance or health.
Yeah, I think on our end, most of our athletes that come in, we do the PT screen. So, right, like joint by joint strength, joint by joint mobility, kind of where you at, right? We peel all the layers back, take all the context back, kind of just how do you move? That's something that happens with everyone. Our set of battery tests from the physical side that we always do. We do a hands on hip, arm swing, counter movement jump. We do a hands on hip and arm swing rebound jump on our Hawkins force plates. We do a mid thigh pull. Then we have a Dynaspeed unit. So we do a 1% or 1 kg run, close, pretty much body weight. And then we do a 22% run. Now, I will say, depending on the group, depending on the athlete, metrics we pull are unique. We have our standard ones, right? But for same thing, we talk about the beauty of the role that we're in. Like every sport is so unique in what they find valuable. We talked to some of the basketball guys. We had, a couple of our basketball guys, and we got to meet with some like there was about 4 or 5 just high-end staffs or practitioners. I tell you what, basketball's understanding of
Oh,
tendon health of the lower leg
yep.
blew me away.
Sure.
Unreal. Right, wrong, or different, if a guy gets a groin injury, like they all run to me like, hey, what do we do? Now, granted, the mechanism's usually different. Usually it's because some guy moved away he wasn't supposed to that got the groin injury, as opposed to hockey where it's more of an overuse thing.
Sure.
But it's like, hey, oh, groins, like this group is pretty good with this. Or it's low back. You look at baseball, their understanding of the biomechanics of their sports movements, like they're so far advanced in some of those stuff. And so what we've done a really good job, I feel like, is we work with these teams, we work with people, practitioners in the field because they see this all the time,
Yep.
and let them kind of dictate slightly in some of our metrics as we move more to that technical stuff.
Good.
What are they looking at? What are they valuing? What metrics do they find important? Some sports it's relative peak power. Other sports it's just peak power because the implement you're hitting or throwing doesn't change depending on your weight. And so everyone's a little bit unique and a little bit different. And so what we're trying to do is better understand what teams are looking for. So one now is we're looking for our athletes in the recruiting process, or they're coming back, they're looking to train. It's like, hey, here's a sheet of paper. Here's what my team said I need to get better at. Okay, that gives us insight into what that team's values. What are things that we need to do as far as like one, performance is our number one driver, but you being looked at in a positive light by your organization, everyone wins there. And so how do we kind of move the needle that is important for them and you? So
You
I
know,
guess to answer your question, the metrics kind of depend on the sport, but also what the teams are kind of giving us from feedback as well too. We have our staples from a health and wellness,
yep.
but then some of those other ones are fluid from sport to sport or team to team.
We've done now probably for the past probably 5 years. A lot of the data has gone back further than that, but specifically with our force plates for our organization of teams that we train, we call it the POE. So we train 3 teams, hockey teams. And I say test, I'm using air quotes, we monitor 5 to 6 times a year. And the testing battery is quite simple: vertical jump, arms akimbo. We do a mid thigh pull. We do chin ups, loaded chin ups. We do a 10-meter sprint. We do a watts per pound bench press with half their body weight, very similar to the NHL combine. And then one of the things, we have 2 basically handouts. One is for the player, and they get to see a radar graph of where they are in comparison to their team. And I like the idea of, I hate trying to bucket players, but you're a racehorse or a Clydesdale, right? One, your power and speed, you're more of a Clydesdale. Let's focus on some other areas here relative to where you are the team. And then conversely, you're one of the heavier guys on the team. You're pulling, you have the most peak force, peak power, peak force, excuse me. Perhaps we need to work on being more accustomed to being a racehorse, or have maybe some, but the interventions that we do are so minor. It doesn't look like a facelift. We just toy around with 1 or 2 things, right? And then the last thing I'll say is, and I don't know if you've done this, I always struggle with this for the longest time. Someone said, well, what's good? Well, this is great. You can always look at the research, right? But what we started doing is we created longitudinal data. So we collected it from year over year over year, and we put it into really kind of a box and whisker plot, but it allowed us to tease out average, above average, below average. So if someone's testing or monitoring for an 18, 16, or 15, I can say, here's where you're at, you're average. Hey, you're above average. Are those things that you see are from your experience in the field as being, beneficial to athletes in keeping that longitudinal data over time?
That's how you know it works. Every time we put an athlete through something, right? It's an educated guess. It's a hypothesis, right? It's, hey, this should work for you for this. Let's test you. Let's do that. Let's retest you. Did that move the needle for you in the area we thought, more than we thought, less than we thought, or did it move another needle? The more you can repeat that process, the more you start to get a better understanding of what works with that athlete to move whatever adaptation you're looking to get. So I think like we hear people say like, oh, just give them really good programming. Like, yeah, it's a good start, but at certain times or certain points of the year, you want to move the needle or you want to nudge them in one direction or another. So whether you're measuring stuff, no, I think you can swing too far the other way of the pendulum, right? You can let the metrics dictate what you're doing as opposed to kind of informing you where you start to nudge people one way or another. So having the resources and having that information, you can always go back and it's like, oh, hey, actually, we were always looking at this metric. Like we mess this stuff up all the time on our end. Like we're constantly looking at things. It's like, you know what, maybe that wasn't as good of a metric for that as we thought it was. But like that's this. Well, now we still have that data. We still have those jumps. We can still go back and look. I'm like, because as much use of the data is dictated by one, what time do you actually have to dig into it? What
Oh
time,
yeah,
like you said,
no
you can
doubt.
spend all day on one jump. 100% you can't. But sometimes, like if you're afforded that luxury, there's some interesting things you can realize from trends and some of these deeper metrics that, or just even like looking at the tracing, like you have a pretty good understanding of how someone chose to jump. Now, is it because they can't slam on the brakes or because they just chose to use momentum? That like there's so much, it depends.
It's so true. I think the two things that you had mentioned, if you have the time, right? I think Mike Boyle
Yep.
had tweeted this a while back. He was talking about like force plates, and he's like, let me get this straight. He's referencing like big sports teams, right? Someone's paying you to have the time to learn that in the private sector. Many times that's not afforded, right? Like number
Yep.
one, the budget's not there. Number two, you can't pay someone to. You're learning it yourself more than likely, right?
Correct.
So there's always that trade-off. The other thing that I think you just mentioned, the trace of the force time curve. This was something that my friend Dr. Mal McHugh had talked to me about. He said, "Anth, I barely look at the numbers on a force plate jump." He said, "What I look
Yep.
at is the shape." He said, "It's like an EKG of a heartbeat." And I thought about it, and then I read some of Dan Cleather's work on force, and he
Yep.
talks about improving impulse, which is essentially like total force, right, or total
Yep.
strength. And he said, you can do it a couple ways. And he said also, this is interesting that I thought was really interesting. Dan Cleather talked about it. Again, looking at the force time curve. He said there's a direct relationship between improving impulse and improving the change of velocity. And I thought about it. And then if you look again at the force time curve, if you increase peak force, it's a higher mountain. If you increase
Higher.
peak
Yep.
force, it's a steeper mountain. If you increase total force, it's a wider mountain. And I think of it that way now, and it's an easy aha moment for me. I actually prefer, again, if you have the time, and not many people do, of looking at the actual traces before and after, as opposed to dealing with the minutia and the numbers. Sometimes a picture tells 1,000 words.
Yeah. And sometimes, like if you're just looking at outputs, like that, they can guide you in the wrong way, depending on the phase you just went through, right? Like it's a GPP, it's a general strength phase. Like you just open the door to more depth because they feel more comfortable because they have strength in some of these range. Like you might see some of these outputs drop off because of that. But the shape of the curve will tell you that. Like they chose a different strategy. They're not worse off as the output would tell you. They're not worse off from a performance standpoint. What you did is now you created a capacity to, as you continue to develop through your off season or through your programs, you've created different capacities or different kind of strategies to that they can utilize. So it gives you context into because sometimes, like I said, if it's just hey, jump height or power or whatever it is, like the whole thing is what are you expecting to happen to the curve? What are you expecting to happen to outcomes? And then it's understanding if those things do or do not happen, what adjustments do you need to make moving forward?
So true. I like it. All right, let's talk about. I'm going to jump all over the place today, but let's talk about because you got some unique experience. Where do you see right now? I always ask this question from for practitioners, at least in strength and conditioning. Like, where do you see right now we're at as a whole performance landscape? Where's the pendulum swinging? I mean, what are we doing well? Let me start by asking that, and then maybe what are we overly concerned with that I think perhaps we're doing poorly? Where are we?
To me, one of the things I think we're doing really, really well is that we're trying to better understand the athlete. I tell you, man, I'm on calls fairly regularly with different tech companies. We are getting pretty good at better understanding what athletes are going through, what athletes are experiencing, whether that's through training, through recovery, from the biomechanical standpoint, like better understanding what's happening through some of these specific movements. Where I feel like we're getting so far developed in that one, but obviously you look at the other side of the pendulum coming in, we are just flooded with information. And I feel like we're having a hard time within different settings of being able to take that information, synthesize it, process it. And every setting is going to have the different difficulties with that. But I feel like getting information on athletes right now is relatively easy to do in all these different areas, but it's making sure that you're not kind of losing the forest for the trees a little bit, and that you're not just so overwhelmed with data you don't know what to do with any, and there's not a lot of actionable items. So I think what we're doing well is like it's very important to be able to capture those things. I think that's the direction that you need to move is better understanding the athlete experience. But we're losing a little bit because one, you're losing the athlete because if you're measuring all this stuff, you're not be able to make actionable changes on the back end, you lose interest really, really quick. right? Why the heck am I wearing this wearable? Why am I wearing this for the workout if nothing's changing from the guy that's over there and his heart rate's saying something completely different? Like that's an easy way to lose the athlete if you're asking them to put on all these things,
And
track
I've
all these
made
things,
and I've
and they
made
don't
those
do it.
and I've made those mistakes. I've made plenty of those mistakes. It's interesting. I heard this the other day, and it's too much objective information. I'm paraphrasing. Dehumanizes the experience. You know
100%.
that. The old Socrates quote: "An unexamined life is not worth living." Well, so is an overexamined life. I mean, think
Yeah.
about, I again, when I say I made these mistakes and continue to make them, hopefully I learn from those. But I just remember early and often, a red window showed up. Oh, we're not training today, or hey, and it's one of
Yep.
those deals where it's just one small piece of a massive puzzle. And the reality is, we'll never put that puzzle together. It's not sports performance,
Yep.
in my opinion, is not a puzzle. It's a mystery. Yeah, we've got ideas. We've definitely got some good research to go on, but we all know that anytime you're dealing with human beings, it's very, very complex and messy. And
Yep.
A doesn't always equal, the outcome that you desire for that specific person.
100%. I think what you do, and the more you experience with different technologies and the more you kind of play around with different things, is I think you get better at asking questions. I think you get better, right? You see that one red dot, and it's like, oh, don't pull the chute on them right now. Like, go ask how they slept. Go ask, whatever it is, given the context of what you're measuring. But just go ask a better question and then use, right? That's the art, right? The science is like, hey, something's going on here. Fire alarm's going off. Is it because there's a fire right next to the alarm or there's something going off in the area? Let's go explore now. And so I think that's what just experience and context kind of lends to you is the ability to just ask better questions and really hone in on what's going on, right? Better understanding the athlete. And I think that's where the art is. I think sometimes you can get too far the other way and it's like, right, red dot, you sit out, or red dot, you only have two sets of this, or whatever it is. And it's like, well, why is the dot red in the first place, right? Working on the problem upstream and trying to see if there's better solutions from like sleep strategy or nutrition. You didn't eat anything before you came here. Whatever it is, like you can use the context as it is, but just asking better questions is what the tech is usually allowing us to do.
I think another thing that really is maybe interest me, maybe in a really boring way, but I challenge myself with it. And I think that this comes from conversations with people way smarter than me, including Patrick Ward, is actually the reliability of the metric itself. Like there's times that we capture things and we make decisions as sports scientists, and there might be a metric that's completely unreliable. Like we're making decisions that really perhaps we shouldn't make. And that's prompted me into doing my own due diligence on certain things. As we know, certain technologies you can, like you talked about before, you can spend a day on a jump.
Yeah.
So it's one of those deals where it's opened my eyes as well. So at any rate, I digress. Advice, rewind your career back. Give advice to the young Curt Truhe. Is there anything that you would do different, or perhaps a younger coach coming up right now who, hey, I want to work in the NHL. I want to work with professional athletes. What advice would you give them? And by the way, our landscape. I'm older than you, man. You can see that in my hairline. Okay, but
Yeah,
I
I
can
got
tell
the
you
grays
that
coming in, so we just got different strategies here.
but I can tell you, man. There's times where I don't know. I don't know if I feel. Sometimes I feel maybe not feel bad. That's the wrong word. But I can. Man, if I'm a young coach coming up right now, it's just information overload coming from everywhere. Like how do you get signal? So that's my question. What would you do differently, or what advice would you give?
No, I think you're completely right. And I think even, mine and your experiences are different than what kids are going through now. Like we have an internship program, or I think now that we're an agency, we call it an associate program, but we have them come in all the time and they know so much book information. Like they can sit there and they can tell you everything they've read and they know a lot more than we
Yeah.
did because I think they had so much more access to it. But I think what they're losing is the ability to kind of look peripherally and the ability to kind of look at things in a different way. And right, it's the Dunning-Kruger thing that you talked about. They're coming out and they have all the answers right now and they want to tell you every cue that they can think of before you get in that squat and they're overanalyzing everything. It's just like seek mentorship and just try to have conversations, I would say would be the biggest thing. Just try to meet people, try to have conversations and seek to understand before kind of giving input. I think that's a big one is just And I guilty as anyone else. I remember it was not that long ago of like you see something on Instagram, you see something on Twitter, that's stupid. Right? But now it's like, well, why? Why are they doing that? Why could they be doing that? And if you're really interested, reach out. Why are they doing that? And for the most part, like there's it gives you insight into someone else's thinking. And I say this all the time to our interns. It's like when you come into this process, you might have thoughts or ideas coming in, fully embrace in our system, in our process, and just do everything. Do the workouts, do the programs, do all the workouts, like run the warm-ups the same way we do, whatever it is. And then on the back end, when you leave, you're going to see the things you liked, the things you didn't like, the things you thought worked, the things that you felt. Now your personal anecdotes. I'm like, when we interview our interns right after they leave, they're like, oh yeah, like I learned some stuff. They come back a month later. It's like, what did you really learn? It's like, oh my gosh, like I left this place. I felt like when I was talking to you guys, I had to give the answer that you wanted to hear. I had to show the warm up that you wanted to do. I had to do this, whatever. He's like, I had to be you. I had to be one of the other coaches. They remove themselves from it. They come back and it's like, oh, it's like Mr. Miyagi, right? Like wax on, wax off. Like, now I get it. I took what you said into my own thoughts. And now this is where I'm currently at. And so just the more of those experiences you can have, the better.
Absorb, modify, and apply. I think we've done an internship program now for going on 15 years, and I think this is just my opinion too. I think people come in with these big grand ideas of this internship. The reality is they're dealing for the most part in our internship programs with youth hockey players. So people that have training ages that are minimal at best. It's a simple program done well. It's a
Yep.
simple program done well. But there's a reason, there's a method, there's a rhyme for everything put on that piece of paper. But I think what I see a lot is the interest in always working with a professional athlete. Well, let me tell you that's about 3% of our business at Donskov Strength and Conditioning, right?
Yep.
Having said that, simplicity can also work for a professional athlete, but for different ways, right? In different ways. I think when I look at this, looking at young coaches now, and by the way, I'm guilty of this. So point the thumb. Almost like 90% of the articles are written for 10% of the population, and the 10% of the population are elite athletes. Like young Tommy, who's built like a coat hanger, just needs something really, really simple, right? Progressive overload, linear periodization, same simple approach can work totally different, maybe a different program, but for different reasons for a professional hockey player or a professional athlete that have advanced training ages. But underwhelmed might not be the right word, but I do feel that once they get involved in the internship, they see the whys behind it. They see from a physiological standpoint, biomechanical standpoint. But at the end of the day, I'm getting off again here on a tangent. Simplicity can be the ultimate sophistication, but you got to know why you're doing it, right? You got to be prepared
Sure.
to defend that as a young coach every time you put something on a piece of paper. That makes great coaches, in my opinion.
For sure. You mentioned great athletes is who the studies are for. And I tell you what, I've seen a lot of pro athletes that aren't great athletes.
Yeah.
And just the understanding that thinking that goes hand in hand, right? This guy made it to this level, especially in hockey is one of those sports that you can get hyper skilled guys that just physically are so underwhelming. I can't tell you the amount of guys like you go to the combine, they go to do a vertical jump and throw their arms down as they're jumping. They're doing like JP and I, we used to go to the combine every year. We'd sit right in front of the 5-10-5 shuttle. And it's like, let's just see who the athletes are. The real athletes. Let's see who knows how to move. Let's see who knows figure out angles, the jump height, all the other stuff. Like we can go look at those numbers. We can figure that out easy. We have access to that information. Let's see who knows how to move. Let's see who's a good athlete. Um, so I think that's an important thing to mention too, is that just because they make that level and for those that are out there that are like hell bent on working with pro athletes, I tell you what, it is one of the most difficult groups to work with. You're getting them in their off season. That's their time to do vacations. That's their time to be a family man. Like they are inconsistent. And in some of these sports, like you think the NFL, we get them for like 6 weeks and then they have a month of like OTAs and mini camps. And then they come back for like they're so inconsistent and in and out and bouncing around, and they have maybe a guy they go to for their running stuff. And
Continuity,
it's wonderful.
continuity, and that's the other thing.
Yes.
We deal with that in the private sector now. It's even getting worse. You've got strength coaches, speed coaches, power coaches. And in some cases, you find out after there's even another strength coach. They're going. It's like, oh my gosh, guys, how many cooks can we have in the kitchen?
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Yep. 100%.
I was going to ask you advice to coaches, but I'm going to rephrase it. If you're looking at a young coach, guy or gal, what are the qualities that you would admire that you would want on your team, on your staff?
Is that we hit on a little bit too, but curiosity. For us, like when we're evaluating through our interview process for our associate position, we have something on there. It's like emotional intelligence. To me, one of the best qualities that you can have as a coach is the ability to anticipate what's about to happen, the ability to anticipate problems. If we're on the third set and we have 4 sets, I want to see you walk over, look at the card, and start to look what the next series of exercises is going to be. As they're finishing something up, like you put that one away, and then when they're done with that last set, it's like, boom, you're onto this. It's already set up, ready for you. You can't set it up on the front end because you don't have the space, but like someone that can anticipate problems, right? Oh, they're on their last set of the auxiliary block. I need to go start making shakes. Oh, towels are delivered on Thursday. Like I can go start full, like whatever it is, the ability to anticipate and needs from the staff, from the athlete, like the more that you can do that, I think that is such an art that is kind of lost. I tell you what, there's some very smart people that just sit there in the back of the room and just retroactively like come tell you what they thought. It's like I'm like, you could have been so much more hands-on if you just started to see that.
100%. That is so true. It's something I feel like we're one of the same here when we're speaking. That's something I see as well in young coaches. Hey, be proactive. If you're going to come with a problem, have a solution, or like you said, be proactive. Have the B block out on the tail end of the A session or the A block. What can you do to help? Be a sous chef. Those are all great things. All right. Where can we find out more about you via social media?
Instagram and Twitter, both at Curt_Truhe. Obviously, like a lot, like I said, the beauty of what I get to do now is I don't have to be over salesy. That's just not my personality. There are people that are very, very good at that and create business by being able to do that. But I do throw stuff out there. I repost some of the information. You might get a kid post mixed in here or there to see some of the young kids running around. But that's where you can find a lot of my stuff.
Awesome, buddy. Talk to me real quick too about family. 2 boys, 3 boys.
3, just had our third boy.
You're gonna run a small island sometime soon, eh?
Exactly. We got our forward line all set up, ready to go.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, man.
Our guest today has been Curt Truhe. Curt, so thanks so much for joining us, my friend.
Of course. Thanks for having me.